Please welcome Douglas Brunt and Jennifer Egan.
Welcome. I think I'm the most excited person in the whole room. I remember reading A Visit from the Goon Squad on a train, Amtrak, DC to New York, and loving it and thinking, wow, she is so talented. What if I could meet her one day? And so now I'm starstruck, and hopefully I'll make it through the interview. So it's wonderful to have you here, Jennifer, and we had a little bit of time to talk this morning to discuss the interview, and we have a few friends in common who all said she is the kindest. In addition to being gifted and brilliant, she is the kindest, warmest person you'll ever meet, and it was totally true.
You haven't seen my dark side yet.
So I have done a lot of reading, of course, to get ready for the interview, and I read where this novel, Manhattan Beach, which we'll talk mostly about in addition to other things, but was about 15 years in the making. You began in the 9/11 era. You took a break and stepped away to write the Keep and A Visit from the Goon Squad. Took a little break, won this Pulitzer thing, whatever, and came back. But can you talk a little bit about your 15-year experience with this book?
Sure. I mean, I think that in a way there were kind of two big phases. I got interested in New York during the war years. Around like 2003, 2004, and I do think it was related to 9/11 because I lived in New York then as I do now, and it was really shocking to see a city I knew so well become transformed into a war zone in the span of a single day. And it led me to wonder what it was like for New York to feel like a possible war zone, during a matter of years. So I just got sort of interested in what that experience was like for New Yorkers. And so I started in a very desultory way. I mean, my kids were really little. I was working on other things, but I started sort of thinking about the New York. Well, I actually started by just looking at images of New York during World War II. And what came through so clearly, to my surprise, was that the waterfront was visible in almost every image. It felt as if the center of the city was at its edges then. And that's a really surprising notion to a New Yorker now. I mean, our waterfront is being revitalized, as so many are, but you would never say, like, that's where the action is, on the waterfront. For joggers, that's true, but, for most people, no. So it led me to think about the port of New York, which I think it's fair to say I had not given one moment's thought in the decades I had been living in the city. And so curiosity about the port led me to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was an incredibly important shipbuilding facility it was actually the largest in America during World War II. And that led me to researching the Navy Yard, which led me to deep sea diving and various other things. So I was I was researching without knowing what my story would be, because when I write fiction, I really don't start with characters or even a plot. I just start with a time and a place. So all I was doing with this research was trying to get a better sense of the kind of texture of this time and place. And that went on for about 5 years. And it actually got quite detailed in that I helped to work on an oral history project, a kind of formal one, with the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And we interviewed many people who had worked at the Navy Yard during the war, and very fascinating conversations. And this is all before 2010, so these people were in their 80s. And I'm very glad I spoke to them then, because that opportunity might not, and in fact in many of those cases would not have existed once I started working on the book, like actually writing, and that was in 2012. So there was this kind of vaporous research period where I was learning without knowing what I was trying to learn, and then there was the actual writing, which started in 2012 and involved lots of research of its own.
I also read that in your early, I don't know if it was early drafts or just early thoughts about the book, but you had experimented with the idea of having time leaps more into the present day, or maybe the 9/11 kind of a day, and you abandoned that maybe on some advice of a writing group, a mysterious writing group?
Yes. Well, I've been part of a writing group actually since the late 80s, so really my whole career. Our personnel has changed over the years, but our methodology is a little bit unusual. We only read aloud. So we walk into the room and someone reads their work aloud. We all listen, we all hear it at the same time, and then we give some responses. And what I find is that it cuts through people getting caught up in little things, and it kind of forces everyone to focus on the big stuff, as well as, of course, making everyone hear the language, sort of the sounds and the rhythm of the language. So I had this idea, since 9/11 in a way was the, in some ways inspiration is the wrong word, the catalyst for my interest in New York during the war. I thought, okay, somehow 9/11 is going to be in this book. I'm going to be drawing the reader's attention right from the start to the fact that we all know it's actually the 21st century and 9/11 happened and that really changed New York. And I thought, I'll just have to, I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. And so I found myself writing with a kind of intervening narrative voice that would, on occasion, draw the reader's attention to those facts that I just said. And so I was trying to figure out if this voice was working, and I brought this section into my writing group several times. And the first time I read it, and they said, well, we're interested in this period, we're sort of interested in some of these textures, but when you do that thing of calling our attention to the fact that it's the 21st century, it really pulls us out of it. We don't like that part. So I brought it back, having tried to fix it in some way, and they said, no, it's really still not landing at all. I tried yet again, and this time they were a little more severe, and they said, we find that it makes us very angry when you do that.
Interesting.
And I thought, this is not the reaction I want from my readers, obviously. And when I dug deeper, they said the reason they were angry was that the narrator seemed actually to be sort of talking down to the reader. Like they said, you seem to think we are going to forget what century it is without your help. We won't. We know where we are. And they also said that the narrator seemed almost, there was something sort of intervening and kind of presumptuous about this narrator. So I thought, I got to let all of that go. I'm just going to be in this story and telling this story and not trying to also comment upon it in this way. And so I'm so grateful to my writing group for the,
what an incredible resource to have. Before we come back to novel, I just want to actually stay on the writing group for one more question. Are they other novelists, and how often do you get together?
We're a very, it's not working? Okay. It's funny because I'm getting an echo, but we are kind of a mixed bag. We have a poet, a playwright, a couple of fiction writers, and an essayist. One guy, and the rest are female. And one of us is in California, so we FaceTime with her. And it's really, I think the key with a writing group is you want to make sure everyone is essentially on your side and will take ownership of your success rightly, while also being honest. And that's a difficult balance to strike. Not everyone is on your side. Not everyone does want you to succeed. And, someone like my mom, who very much wants me to succeed, is not as good about being honest, and perhaps is a bit biased in my favor. So she's not an ideal writing group member. But it's finding that balance, and I'm so grateful to them. And how we meet basically on an as-needed basis. Lately, we've been meeting once or twice a month.
Oh, wow, that's frequent. That's
yeah.
Great. Well, you brought the period to life on the page in the book so well, and I know you did extensive research to do that, and it's in there subtly and solidly. And I loved where the book took me when I got in there. And the pitfall for a writer, of course, is to, you don't want to do all this research and then just fling it at the reader. And can you talk about how not only you did it, but how you thought about incorporating it into the book?
Well, as I said, there were these two phases. So the initial one was just that I kind of immersed myself in various people's stories about that time. Any elderly New Yorker I heard of with a good memory found him or herself talking into my recorder. And that included, I would be sitting at my kid's Little League game and overhear someone talking about an elderly dad who had been in New York a long time. Boom, I was there talking to him. So I sort of gathered up all these stories, and all of that was just helping me to feel like I was sort of able to actually inhabit that time and place imaginatively, which is crucial if you don't know who your characters are and you don't know what your plot is. You have to have some kind of time and place that feel alive. So that was sort of what the first phase was. But interestingly, out of those conversations and these oral history interviews, certain themes, certain things came back again and again. One was organized crime, which I had not been expecting to write about, but which, as it turns out, was really a big feature of waterfront life in New York. And that I learned pretty quickly, but the thing I wasn't expecting, and we talked about this earlier, again and again in these oral history interviews, people would mention gangsters. People knew gangsters. They, their sister dated a gangster. The musicians like to play in quote-unquote gangster clubs. And I found myself thinking, how is it that so many people knew gangsters? That's not so much the case, at least in my crowd in New York. And as I dug deeper, I realized that it really had a lot to do with Prohibition. And Prohibition went on for much longer than I had realized. 1919 to 1933, with alcohol being illegal in America. Imagine that. So, of course, Americans still wanted to drink. And so organized crime as we know it got organized to take over the liquor business. And gangster, which kind of meant in those years some involvement in the liquor trade, became a quasi-respectable job description, and even a kind of dashing one. Yeah. So I began to, but then I also learned that after Prohibition was over, lots of changes occurred in the world of organized crime. One was a big income stream was cut off. So at that point, organized crime got into some other businesses that before that had been less common. Prostitution, narcotics, eager to make up this income stream that had been cut off. And that caused cultural divisions and other conflict within the world of organized crime. And some quote-unquote gangsters didn't want to remain, wanted to somehow cross over into legitimacy. Yeah. And that was actually very hard to do. So I began to sense that evolution, that some sort of organized crime figure with a wish to cross over would be present in the book. That's kind of all I knew about that.
And I love that. There's so many great twists and turns and reveals in the book that we don't want to stray into spoiler territory. But clearly, this research led to Dexter Stiles, our sort of gentleman gangster who is able to somehow, partially successfully, straddle both the legitimate and illegitimate worlds. Can you talk a little bit more about Dexter and how he drives the novel and what he means to the book?
Yeah, well, he is a kind of classic figure of this sort. He's drawn into organized crime through the liquor trade as a young person, eager for upward mobility. He sees that the gangsters that his father, who's a restaurant owner, has to deal with have fancy stuff. He's excited by that. He sort of becomes involved with them very much against his father's wishes, and ultimately becomes a very important guy, sort of a crime boss figure. Meanwhile, he is married to a banker's daughter, a sort of blue-blooded New York family who have major qualms about him, but let's just say they really didn't have a choice but to let him marry their daughter. So he's straddling a number of worlds. He's now a nightclub owner, as many former speakeasy owners became after Prohibition ended. And that's another reason that kind of gangster, there was a quote-unquote, and I say that only because it could mean a number of different things, but in the world of New York nightlife, in which former speakeasies were prominent, you would find a lot of these figures like him. And so he's straddling a number of different worlds and seeming to do so with relative ease, but then problems emerge as the book goes on.
One of the things you also capture really well in the book is some of the challenges faced by women and by African Americans in that period, and the social constraints, for women and our protagonist, Anna. Even to live alone is viewed, you either have loose morals or you're a witch or something, and let alone the kind of jobs like a diver that you can take on. And we were talking this morning, and I was wondering, it feels, wondering if you felt that it was sort of an empowerment message along the lines of either race or gender. And you're saying that's not the primary thing, maybe, but...
I never really think about having a message. I mean, I'm a journalist as well, and I guess I feel like fiction is really the realm of mystery, finally. I'm much more interested in kind of asking questions than trying to answer them. But I was very interested in the strange kind of liminal experience that women had during the war, which I had learned about in school, as I think many of us do. You know, women had opportunities that they had never had before. They really excelled in the world of industry, and then they were expected to go back into the kitchen and start baking in the 1950s. That was kind of the story as I had heard it. But it was amazing to have that story become more concrete when I actually heard women telling me that story as we interviewed them for the Oral History Project. And so to give one example, a woman named Ida Pollock, we interviewed her, she was in her 80s. She had been a welder, and she described welding in sensual terms. There's no other word for it. She was a great welder, and she was also very petite, which was a huge asset in welding. For the first couple of years women worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they were not allowed to go on ships. And the fear was that the men in these close quarters would not be able to control themselves. Of course, we know that's not a problem at all. But things have changed so drastically. In the end, it behooved the Navy Yard to get the women onto the ships because physically, in some ways, they were better adapted to working on ships. They tended to be slighter. They were often more limber. And Ida, the welder, was, I think, barely 5 feet. So she could sort of get into these nooks and crannies and weld in ways that men could not. And she actually achieved some seniority and had people working under her. So the war ended, and all the women were fired, as they knew they would be, but I think still somehow hoped maybe they wouldn't be. And Ida thought she was working class and needed a job, and she thought, well, I'm not going back to the phone company. You know, I'm gonna keep welding. So she applied for welding jobs repeatedly, and not only was she not able to get a welding job, she was actually laughed at for hoping to do a job that she had done to great acclaim within the previous year. I mean, talk about whiplash. And so that was very interesting to me. And she was still mad in her 80s. And she even said at one point, you know, I would walk across the bridges and in New York, I would look at the welding. It was terrible. You know, so that sense of injustice was so alive in her, and the sense of all these talents and possibilities that the women had never even imagined they were capable of being open to them during the war was so interesting to me. I'm always fascinated by times when the normal rules of life are lifted for whatever reason. I love writing about people who are traveling. I'm interested in people who try to reinvent themselves. And this was a moment when, for women, the impossible not only became possible, but really became necessary. Women were not just asked to do these jobs, but really begged to do them. And they did them beyond anyone's expectations, and then they were taken away. So that was fascinating to me.
I can see why there'd be a temptation to make these time leaps, because you can draw some of these things where things have improved or not, as you say, with the office environment there. Did you, in your research, did you ever take a look at these dive suits or try one on?
Well, so I should just say that diving is a big part of the book, for those of you who haven't read it. That came about very naturally because I learned in reading every issue of the Navy Yard newspaper that was produced there, that there had been a lot of civilian divers at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. There was a whole civilian diving program that recruited people who worked, men were all I knew of, who worked in various other trades and needed this help. Repairing ships from underneath, examining damage, all the things that are required when lots and lots of impaired ships come into a harbor. And so I got very excited about diving. And I kept thinking I wanted to find a way to get a female diver into the water, although I wasn't sure I could do it incredibly, and it actually was not easy. One thing that made it possible to do it is that the civilian diving program at the Navy Yard, and in fact in New York, there was a huge civilian diving program also on the piers of Manhattan. They were very little documented, so no one really knows who did the work. And so my research for diving was in some ways very granular. Like I read lots of diving manuals from that era, and I read them. They were like catnip to me. I could not get enough of them. I would be on the elliptical machine at the gym reading a diving manual from 1935, and the people next to me are like, "Wow, I don't know." And then I actually was able to, well, first of all, I was actually dressed in the old Mark V diving suit, which is what all of us probably conjure when you say old-fashioned diver with the big spherical helmet. I fell in with an Army diving veterans group. And they kindly invited me to their reunion, which happens every other year. And one of the things they offer at their reunion is the chance for veterans to wear the old equipment and dive in a tank. So they asked if I wanted to be dressed in this apparatus, and I said, of course, not quite understanding how incredibly uncomfortable it would be, but it was great to have that chance. And I also, in the Maritime Museum of San Francisco, there are lots of old diving artifacts, the old air compressors, because the air compressors were operated manually. So you're 40 feet under the water, and the only thing that is bringing breathable air to you is two guys turning cranks on a pier. Kind of scary, but I was able to view all of that old machinery and the old diving suits and the helmets and every aspect of the equipment they have there.
The relationship between Anna and her father is so complicated and was really powerful to read. And I remember reading it thinking, I wonder how much she's using of her own life and her own experiences to sort of pour into these characters. And then I saw Anna Quinlan last night, and she's like, make sure you ask her. You know where I'm going. She said, that you don't do that, really. You don't use your own biographical information to bring into the novel. You kind of take another way.
I'm bad at that. It's my worst area as a writer. For some reason, when I feel like I'm starting to get into my own life, I go very cold. And I think part of it is what really motivates me to write is this sense of discovery and escape, like the thrill of actually getting to live another life. And that is really undercut, obviously, if suddenly the life I'm living is just my own life again. So I tend to do that really badly. But I do find, and probably in this book more than any other, that certain aspects of my own history do find their way in. And I think in particular, I described how I sort of started with the waterfront, got to the Navy Yard, and then I found myself getting very, in New York anyway, the waterfront was dominated in a very clannish and exclusive way, certain parts of it, by Irish and Irish Americans. They kept everyone else out. They especially disliked the Italians. And so I started to learn more about sort of Irish American culture in New York during the war years, which then led me to be interested in Irish American culture before that, and certain pathologies that came over with the Irish during the famine from the oppression by the British, which is where they started. And all of this sort of led me back to my own family, because my father was part of a very clannish Irish American world in Chicago. My grandfather was a cop. My father was supposed to be a priest, but he wasn't. The celibacy part was a deal breaker for him. So he ended up a lawyer, but there's a lot of law enforcement in that side of the family. And also a lot of storytelling and laughter, but also a huge amount of repression. And in particular, my father was one of three boys. He was the oldest, and his younger brother was named Eddie, which is what I named Anna's father in Manhattan Beach. And Eddie was this kind of sparkly, bright star in the family who took a spin on a friend's motorcycle around the block during a 4th of July party, and they were hit, and he was killed. And so my father was a teenager, and as you can imagine, it was just devastating to the family. And according to my uncle, who's the only remaining brother, there was a wake, there was a funeral, and Eddie was never mentioned again. Both my father and my uncle became very serious alcoholics. My father and mother divorced, or rather, their marriage was annulled actually when I was 2. Because, yes, it helps to know the higher-ups in the Chicago church hierarchy to pull that one off. But my father used to talk to me about Uncle Eddie a lot when I was little, and I didn't realize that I was possibly the only person he really talked to about Eddie. So all of that, and I never really got to know my father, who was killed in an accident himself, just when he had just turned 60. All of this is kind of a long-winded way of saying that in this book, I felt like I had a chance to understand the world that made my father and thereby understand him in ways that I never could, because I moved with my mother and stepfather to Chicago. My father remarried. It was a complicated family situation, and I really never got to know him. So I emerged from this book feeling that I did. Of course, he's not here to tell me I'm wrong, but it was a nice feeling, and I guess that in that way there is some autobiography there.
Speaking of names coming in, I just thought of this now. The name of Anna's child is the same name as the name of the boy that was her first sexual experience, and I can't even remember the name of it right now. But is there some connection there, or that's just coincidence?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that in a way that's part of a bigger point, which is that as I found myself writing about a young woman who would become hopefully a diver, if I could get her into the water credibly, well, actually, let me back up further. One of the things that I learned quickly in many of my conversations with New Yorkers who grew up in what's known as tenement New York, so sort of row house New York, is that although the rules governing female sexual behavior were extremely strict at that time, and you absolutely were supposed to be a virgin at marriage, the reality was quite different. These kids, there was not a lot of parental supervision. A lot of these families were very large. The kids basically played outside all the time, and not surprisingly, a lot of sexual contact happened. And so as I found myself writing about this young girl, I began to feel pretty strongly that she was not, quote unquote, innocent in a sexual way. I found that I wasn't actually interested in telling a story about sexual awakening. I had kind of done that in my first book, and it just felt like I had done it. So, yes, so she, like the situations described by many of these people I interviewed, has had a liaison with a boy in her neighborhood named Leon. And what I think was most important for me was realizing that she is not ashamed of that. And she has kind of a secret life, therefore. And so that was sort of an important part of her character that I needed to, that helped to guide me into the person that she becomes.
I had to, just as a point to note, I'm so impressed with your ability to discuss this in detail because, by the time you hand a book, you get to pub date, you've handed it into your editor 6 or 12 months earlier, and then you go on book tour and you can barely remember what happened in the book. You get all these questions like, I'm already on another project. I don't remember this stuff anymore. And this is from 2017, so it's remarkable that you've got the material.
I work on books for long enough that I feel as if I do kind of live with these people, and it's actually kind of strange. Sometimes it's almost hard to distinguish between them and real people that I remember. Like when I imagine going back to Rockford, Illinois, which is where my mother grew up, I feel like my memories of it are of my grandparents, of going to the country club, of being there with my mom, and of characters I wrote about in my novel, Look at Me, who also are in Rockford. So there is a kind of odd way in which it all becomes part of my own past. And these really are relationships of a sort.
I was talking to Scott Turow once, and he works from home, and his office is on the 2nd floor. And when he says goodbye to his wife, he says, well, I'm going upstairs to play with my imaginary friends now. So this is a good segue into process. Can you tell us, I know you write by hand, which is rare for writers these days.
Yeah, I write fiction by hand almost exclusively because since I'm not at all writing about myself, if I can avoid it, and don't know what is going to happen. I mean, I literally sit down with an idea of where without knowing who or what will occur. I'm trying to contact that part of me that I guess is what makes us dream. I mean, if you think about it, we are all incredible storytellers when we go to sleep. We create these rich symbolic texts that transform our own lives and the world around us into something else that is often really powerful, and really remains in our memories. So that's what I'm trying to access when I write a first draft. And the reason is that the ideas I have access to, if I just sit in a chair and think, New York, World War II, what should happen? I don't come up with anything good. I don't come up with things that other people wouldn't easily have thought of too. So I'm trying to get to the things that I can't think of.
Are you writing things down at this stage, just ideas or?
Sure, I write down ideas, but not usually about characters exactly. It'll be more like, as I mentioned before, like a sort of presence of a gangster. I knew there was someone there, but I didn't know much about him. So what I do is, when I'm writing original material, I try to write 5 to 7 pages a day. I use a legal pad. I sit down and I start writing. I often feel like nothing's going to happen. Sometimes I'm right, but I have to fill those 5 to 7 pages. And so I just start writing.
Is there an outline ahead of time, or
No.
you just go? Yeah.
No, I just go. So as you can imagine, a lot of it is quite terrible. I mean, I'm just blathering, kind of literally. It's also illegible, which is good. Because if you're going to write terrible stuff, it's much better not to be reading it as you write it. And in my case, I can't read it. And sometimes I can never read it. I have performed handwriting analysis on myself to try to figure out what I was saying. So I write to the end of the draft. For Manhattan Beach, that meant something like 1,000 handwritten pages over the course of a year and a half. Then I type it, making no changes. I just type it, and I begin to feel terrified of how bad a lot of it is. Then I read it through, and at that point, I try to reckon with what this seems like it could be and how to make it better. And I make my first outline at that point.
Oh,
so the outline comes after I have this, let's call it dream level material, that hopefully has enough good ideas in it that it gives me a sense of what it could be. And then once I have that outline, which is off, I think in Manhattan Beach, it's probably 60 pages of outline, just clarifying what I had, what I wanted it to be, and what specific steps I needed to take to bring it one step closer. Then I edit mostly on hard copies by hand and then type in the changes, and I number my drafts. Sometimes I'll take a pass on the screen. It's not like I can't do that, but I don't find that for fiction my decisions are right when I'm looking at a screen. They seem to be better when I'm looking at a page.
So each draft is a comprehensive revision of the book, pretty much.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
how many of those on average?
Well, I would say probably for Manhattan Beach, maybe 4 big drafts, but I number the drafts of each chapter easily 45, 50 drafts of a chapter. But that sounds so dramatic, but if you think about it, if you're editing on a screen, if you think of each time you go over a paragraph as a draft, they would add up as well. I think the reason it sounds so dramatic is that I'm actually counting those drafts and numbering them.
Have you arrived at this, or is this how you did book 1 through present day?
Well, I'm old enough that I used to be doing it on a typewriter and retyping every draft. So I feel like I've made huge progress. I mean, at least I have a computer now. I have pretty much, I arrived at it a while ago, but it was trial and error. Like, for example, when I wrote my first novel, I wrote it in this kind of blind way that I described, and I typed it up, and I thought that was it. Mm-hmm. I thought, wow, because, any manuscript looks impressive from across the room, and this was no exception, and then I started sending it out. I basically didn't know what was in it. What I had was a terrible first draft, and what I found was that when I sent it out, whoever I sent it to became unreachable. And so I learned the hard way that, I had stopped I had failed to do the last 4 years of the work. I had stopped after the first draft. So trial and error has taught me a lot, but I've been doing it this way for a while now.
So we talked a bit about this morning. There's an article I came across that's a couple years old now where Jennifer has said that she feels she has 20 good years left of writing great novels and maybe seven books in there.
I don't know about great, but...
Well, is there anything you can tell us about what you're working on or what your thoughts are or the future?
I mean, I just, it's not that I have any wish to stop writing ever, but I guess I just started to think about certain projects I knew I wanted to do. Like, for example, although while I worked on Manhattan Beach, I found it so difficult that I thought I would never write another historical novel, I actually have gotten very interested in the 19th century. One thing I loved about working on Manhattan Beach was being out, basically writing about humans before small screens were in our lives. It was so freeing. I mean, there were movies and they were huge, but there was no television and nothing beyond, obviously. And I found that really exciting, to actually to work in a period where technology simply made life, it automatically divided life from life as we know it now. Another thing about the war years is that it was the last era in which most people got around by ship. Air travel for domestic life was very unusual still. So again, that was one of those things that made it exciting and different to be in that period. And so I love the thought of going even further back into the 19th century. And then I'm working right now on a companion to A Visit from the Goon Squad that follows some of those characters, especially the next generation, into other realms. I don't know whether I can really pull that off, but I'm going to try. And then just, I think the reason it sounds more exciting than it is when I say I have, 7 books. What it really means is times and places where I want to be. Another is the West Coast during the 1960s. I feel like the great 1960s novel, Ken Kesey should have done it. Robert Stone might have done it, but they didn't. And so I feel like there's some novel about that era that I've never read. And so I'm wondering if I could try to do it myself. Who knows? I mean, I was a little kid. So I would be, my sense of that period is pretty fuzzy. But that's another, so that's an quote unquote idea, but all it really means is, anyone could have that idea. It's just a time period.
Last question, and then I'll open it up to the floor for some questions too. You have said it's a bit of a gift that you were not right out of the gates this, author to watch hot property, and that you really sort of broke out to superstardom later in your career, midway, I suppose. Superstardom is my word, but it's true. Can you talk about why that is and why you view that as something positive for your career?
I mean, I think I was a kind of a late bloomer. I don't think I was very exceptional as a younger person. And I saw that as a failing in myself for sure, because I think we live in a culture that and this is all pre-internet, just reveres exceptional youth. We love it and we can't get enough of it. But it can be really hard for those exceptional youths because, being called exceptional when you're still developing, I think can be difficult. So I didn't have that problem. And I was able to continue developing at my own pace. I'm not complaining because I was finding readers and I feel like my work was, I was able to sell books and have a career, but by the time A Visit from the Goon Squad came out and it had tremendous good luck, I had been doing it for long enough that I think I had some sense of my identity as a writer, and I'm grateful that that success didn't come much before that.
Yeah, great. Any questions for Jennifer? Yes, ma'am. I'll repeat it after you ask it for the video.
So if you're going to write something that takes place in the 19th century, do you have to think about being pre-Freudian as you...
The question is, you have to be... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The question is, if I'm going to write about the 19th century, am I going to think sort of... I'm in a pre-Freudian world, for example, and a pre-Darwinian world, if I go back far enough. That's exactly what makes it so interesting, to think to think outside of the cultural memories and assumptions that we've held for so long. That is the entire challenge. And I'll tell you what isn't, in a way, the most useful tool in doing that is actually fiction written at the time. I found fiction to be so rich as a resource for me in writing about the 30s and 40s, because so much information is baked into fiction that the writer, him or herself, is unaware of. You know, the way I think of it is that we writers tell stories, and the culture is telling stories through us. We're not in control of a lot of what goes in there because we're not aware of a lot of what we perceive and what we know, especially things we take for granted. So fiction is a very useful way to learn about what those suppositions are, what is taken for granted, what hasn't happened yet. So I read a lot of 19th century fiction.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you deliberately incorporated any of the characters or plots or stories from your dreams into your world?
The question was, do I actually use my dreams? The answer is no. They somehow, maybe the problem is that I don't like to write about myself, and so they do feel very connected to me. Actually, there's one exception though. I had a dream. You know, I'm very interested in a period in America when the West was still very open, and yet city life was very developed. And in fact, a city like New York would have looked in some ways much as it does now, with a lot of its housing stock having been built. And I had a dream that I've not told anyone, so I'm now telling a huge room of people, about just sort of an image of a valley with a sound of wolves and this feeling of being in this very remote place. Actually, looking at this landscape kind of feels akin to the same sort of atmosphere. And I woke up from that and I thought, oh yes, that's somehow that's going to be useful in the 19th century novel. We'll see if I ever actually use it, and if I do, it will be the first time. Yes.
You mentioned gangsters in the book. How about the Italian mafia, their American counterparts? Because I know Lucky Luciano and the Longshoremen were very involved in the docks.
Yes, well, the question is sort of about the Italian mafia and its American counterpart. I got deep into the weeds of all of that. There are some interesting books about it, which I can recommend if you want to know. There was a lot of conflict between the Italians and the Irish Americans, although they worked together very closely. And in fact, they changed their own names sometimes to fit in. So you have Italians calling themselves O'Brien and things like that, sort of trying to create this harmony, which existed at its best during Prohibition. After Prohibition ended, a lot of fissures developed between the Italian Americans and the Irish Americans. Some of it was cultural. Although they were all Catholic, they had different approaches to religious life. The Irish Americans tended to involve religious life in their sort of underworld activities, whereas the Italian men tended to leave religious life more to the wives. I mean, these are all generalizations that I've derived from books. But yes, I got and Lucky Luciano is kind of fascinating because he actually cooperated. The government hired him to try to root out unpatriotic Italian Americans who were possibly, they worried, undermining the war effort. And Lucky got sprung from jail and got to go back to Italy, and as far as I can tell, gave the government absolutely nothing. So this worked very much to Lucky Luciano's benefit. So yeah, lots of stories, interesting books, and we could talk about it.
Jennifer, thank you very much. It's a
My
pleasure.
pleasure. Thank you all.